The air in the great hall of Augsburg carries the weight of winter and the sharper bite of ambition. It is the winter of 1519. A fire, large enough to roast an ox, roars in a hearth the size of a small chapel, yet it cannot chase the chill from the stone floor. The man who kneels there does not feel the cold. His name is Jakob Fugger, and at this moment, he is the most powerful man in Europe that no commoner has ever seen. Before him, on a velvet cushion, rests the weight of a crown, not of gold and jewels, but of debt. He traces the edge of a document with a single manicured finger. It is a contract signed by 7 princes of the Holy Roman Empire. It does not grant him land, nor a title, nor an army. It grants him the right to choose the next emperor. Outside, the cobblestones are slick with a freezing rain, reflecting the torchlight like a river of molten silver. The bells of the city's countless churches begin to toll, a chaotic symphony of faith and politics. Jakob does not look up. He hears not a prayer in the bells, but the clink of coin. In this room, with a quill and a ledger, he has just accomplished what armies of men have died trying to do for centuries. He has purchased the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, but the crown he buys is not for himself. It is merely another asset in a portfolio that already owns the souls of kings. The shadow he casts is longer than any emperor's, and to understand the depth of that shadow, we must first enter the light that forged it. To understand the shadow they cast, we must first step into the light that forged them. The story does not begin with a crown. It begins with a loom. The village of Graben, nestled in the rolling hills of Swabia, offers little to the eye beyond fields of rye and the slow, muddy flow of the Lech River. The year is 1367, and the world is a patchwork of fiefdoms and forests, where a man's life is measured not in gold, but in the length of his shadow over his own plot of land. In a low-ceilinged workshop, the air hangs thick with wool dust, a fine, choking mist that catches the weak winter sunlight filtering through oiled parchment windows. The sound is relentless, the thump of the loom, the click of the shuttle, the rhythmic sigh of the treadle. This is the domain of Hans Fugger, a weaver of modest skill but immoderate ambition. Hans's hands are never still. They move across the warped threads with a practiced, almost violent economy, knotting, pulling, correcting. The cloth he produces is not the fine velvet of Italian merchants. It is honest, coarse wool, destined for the backs of peasants and minor knights. Yet in his chest, beneath the grey tunic stained with lanolin, there burns a fire that has nothing to do with the hearth. He looks at his sons, Ulrich and Georg, who work alongside him, their young backs already bowed from hours at the loom. He sees in their silence not contentment, but a shared, unspoken understanding. They will not die with wool dust on their hands. The turning point arrives not with a fanfare, but with a traveler. A merchant from Augsburg, a city 30 miles to the north, pauses in Graben to water his horse. He wears a fur-lined cloak, and his fingers, when he counts out coins for a loaf of bread, are clean. Ulrich watches him from the doorway of the workshop. The merchant's horse is strong, his saddle leather tooled with patterns Ulrich has never seen. That night the brothers sit on the stoop of their home, the air cooling, the last light bleeding from the sky. Ulrich speaks first, his voice low. He buys cloth in the villages and sells it in the city for 3 times the price. Georg nods slowly. Then we should be the ones selling. This is the moment the Fugger dynasty begins, not with a contract, but with a conversation. The family scrapes together what little coin they possess, sells a plot of land, and Ulrich walks to Augsburg. He does not go as a merchant. He goes as a weaver who understands that the true value is not in the making, but in the moving. He establishes a small trading post, a Niederlassung, buying linen and wool from the surrounding villages and funneling it into the burgeoning markets of the city. The brothers become a bridge between the rural producers and the urban consumers. They are not yet bankers. They are middlemen, hustlers, learning the grammar of commerce, supply, demand, trust, and credit. By the turn of the century, the Fuggers have left Graben behind. They take the name of the city that is now their home, Augsburg, a free imperial city, a crossroads of Europe where merchants from Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League meet. The family settles in the Weberviertel, the weavers' quarter, but they no longer work the looms. Their business is now in copper, silver, and spices. They open a Handelsgesellschaft, a trading company, and their agents ride the mountain passes into Italy, returning with bolts of silk and barrels of alum, a mineral essential for dyeing cloth. The brothers grow wealthy, but more importantly, they grow connected. They lend small sums to local nobles, to knights who need to outfit a retinue, to bishops who want to build a chapel. They do not ask for interest. Usury is a sin, a stain on the soul, but they ask for favors. A letter of recommendation, a reduction in tolls, a plot of land. In 1395, the family achieves a milestone that will prove to be the bedrock of their future. They are admitted into the Guild of Weavers, a formality that grants them citizenship, and with it, a voice in the city's affairs. They are no longer outsiders, they are Augsburgers, but even as they plant their flag in the city's soil, their eyes turn east, toward the silver mines of Tyrol, and west, toward the wool markets of Flanders. The loom has been left behind, but the rhythm of their ambition remains the same, a constant, driving thump, a shuttle flying back and forth, weaving a web that will one day entangle kings. The true architects of the Fugger fortune, however, are not Ulrich and Georg, but the next generation. Jakob Fugger the elder, Ulrich's son, inherits the business in the middle of the 15th century, a time when Europe is stirring from the long slumber of the Middle Ages. Constantinople has fallen to the Turks, sending Greek scholars flooding into Italy and igniting the Renaissance. The printing press is about to shatter the monopoly of knowledge. And the Fuggers, poised at the intersection of northern industry and southern finance, are ready to ride the wave. Jakob the Elder is a man of quiet intensity. His portrait, painted in the austere style of the German masters, shows a face carved from stone, a high forehead, a thin mouth pressed into a line of perpetual calculation, eyes that seem to look through the canvas and into a ledger. He marries into a family of goldsmiths, a strategic alliance that brings with it not just a dowry, but a network of artisans and minters. He expands the family's operations into the mining industry, recognizing that the real wealth of the age lies not in what grows from the ground, but in what is pulled from it. Silver, copper, and the mercury needed to extract them become the new currency of power. But it is his third son, also named Jakob, who will carry the family to heights his ancestors could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. Born in 1459, the young Jakob is marked from childhood for the clergy. His parents, already wealthy, see the church as a path to influence, a way to secure the family's spiritual and social standing. The boy is sent to a monastery to learn his letters and his prayers. He studies canon law, learns Latin, and develops a mind trained in the fine art of theological argument. Yet even in the cloister, the family's blood runs in his veins. While other novices contemplate the divine, young Jakob studies the monastery's accounts, noting the inefficiencies in its land management, the waste in its kitchens. He sees not a house of God, but a business in need of restructuring. The life of a priest never takes hold. His elder brothers die young, victims of the plagues and accidents that cut short so many lives in the 15th century. The family needs a leader, and the studious third son, the one destined for the collar, is called back to the counting house. He arrives in Augsburg, a young man with a shaved head and a mind sharpened by theological logic. He looks at the family's ledgers with fresh eyes. Where his father sees tradition, he sees opportunity. Where his uncles see risk, he sees leverage. He will not be a weaver like his grandfather, nor a merchant like his father. He will be something the world has never seen, a banker who does not simply lend money, but who uses it to reshape the very architecture of power. His first act is to travel south. He does not go as a pilgrim, though the road to Venice is worn smooth by the feet of the faithful. He goes as an apprentice, a student in the greatest school of commerce in Europe. Venice is a city built on water and credit. Its merchants trade in silks and spices, but its true commodity is risk. In the shadow of St. Mark's Basilica, Jakob Fugger learns the tools that will make him the richest man in history: double-entry bookkeeping, the bill of exchange, the art of the compagnia, the joint stock company. He learns that a man's word, if backed by the right amount of gold, can move armies. He returns to Augsburg in the late 1480s, not as a weaver's grandson, but as a Renaissance prince in all but title. He finds the family business strong but unambitious. His father and uncles are content to trade in copper and cloth, to lend small sums to local lords. Jakob sees a Europe in flux, a continent of competing princes who are constantly at war and constantly in need of cash. He understands a truth that will define his life. A king with an empty treasury is not a ruler. He is a supplicant, and Jakob Fugger intends to be the man they supplicate. His first great gamble comes in the mountains of Tyrol. Archduke Sigismund, the ruler of the region, is a spendthrift of legendary proportions. He has drained his treasury on wars, on hunting parties, on the construction of a castle that he has already mortgaged twice. The bankers of Europe, burned by his broken promises, turn him away. Jakob Fugger does not turn him away. He rides into Innsbruck, a young man with a monk's haircut and a banker's heart, and he makes an offer that will shock the established financial houses of the day. He does not offer a loan, he offers a partnership. The terms are simple. The Fugger family will advance Archduke Sigismund an enormous sum, enough to pay his debts and fund his court. In return, they will receive not just interest, but control. Control of the Schwarz silver mines, the richest in Europe, where the veins of ore run so thick that miners carve them out with knives. Control of the copper production that feeds the foundries of Central Europe. The Archduke, desperate and perhaps too arrogant to understand what he is signing, agrees. He sees a loan. Jakob Fugger sees a monopoly. From this moment, the Fuggers cease to be traders in other people's goods. They become producers of the very substance of money. Silver from Tyrol flows into Augsburg, where it is minted into coins stamped with the Habsburg eagle and the Fugger lily. The family establishes its own smelting works, its own refining facilities, its own network of agents who buy and sell across the continent. Rival merchants watch with a mixture of envy and terror. They do not understand how a family of weavers from a village no one has heard of has suddenly become the master of Tyrolean silver. They do not yet understand that Jakob Fugger does not play by the old rules. He writes new ones. The young banker, still in his 30s, now commands a fortune that rivals many princely houses. But he does not build a castle. He does not buy a title. He returns to Augsburg and does something far more significant. He begins to build an institution. He formalizes the family business into a joint stock company, the Fugger von der Lilly, bringing in his brothers as partners, but retaining the controlling interest for himself. He establishes a network of branches across Europe, in Venice, in Rome, in Antwerp, in Lisbon, in Krakow. His agents are not merely clerks, they are trusted lieutenants, men who carry his seal and speak with his authority. They sit in counting houses across the continent, and when a king needs money, they are the first to know. The Fugger Bank is not a building, it is a web, and at the center of that web, in a modest house on the Maximilianstrasse in Augsburg, sits a man with a ledger and a mind that never rests. He does not sleep more than 4 hours a night. He does not entertain. He does not hunt or joust or commission poets to sing his praises. He works. His clerks bring him reports from the branches, and he reads them by candlelight, his quill scratching corrections in the margins, his mind tracing the flows of silver from the mines of Tyrol to the mints of Bohemia, the flows of copper from Hungary to the arsenals of Venice, the flows of credit from the counting houses of Augsburg to the war chests of princes. He is building something that has never existed before, a private financial empire that transcends borders, that operates above the law of any single kingdom, that answers only to its own ledgers. And he is about to put that empire to a test that will determine the fate of Europe. The test arrives in the form of a crown. The year is 1519. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, the man who has ruled Central Europe for a quarter of a century, lies dead in the castle of Wels. His passing leaves a void that threatens to tear the fabric of Christendom. The empire he leaves behind is a patchwork of principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, a sprawling, fractious body that requires a head strong enough to hold it together. Two men step forward to claim the throne. Francis I of France, the brilliant, mercurial king who commands the wealth of the most centralized state in Europe, and Charles of Habsburg, Maximilian's grandson, a 19-year-old who rules Burgundy, Spain, Naples, and the vast, newly conquered territories of the Americas. The election of a Holy Roman Emperor is not a simple matter of birthright. The crown is not inherited. It is bestowed by 7 prince-electors, men whose votes can be bought, traded, and leveraged like any other commodity. The price for the throne, in the spring of 1519, is staggering. Francis I, with the treasury of France behind him, begins to spend. His agents fan out across Germany, carrying chests of gold, promising pensions, bribes, and privileges to the electors. He is confident. He is the richest king in Europe. How can a 19-year-old boy, even one who rules half the world on paper, compete with the gold of France? The 19-year-old boy has something Francis does not possess. He has Jakob Fugger. The relationship between the Fuggers and the Habsburgs has been deepening for decades. Jakob the Rich has been the family's banker, its counselor, its silent partner in the mines of Tyrol and the silver fleets of the Spanish Main. When Charles's father, Philip the Handsome, died young, it was Fugger money that secured the boy's inheritance. When Charles needed to bribe his way to the throne of Spain, it was Fugger credit that made it possible. The Habsburgs have come to understand a fundamental truth. They may rule the world, but Jakob Fugger rules their treasury. Now in the dark days following Maximilian's death, the young Charles turns to Augsburg. He sends his emissaries with a plea that is also a confession. He has no money. The Spanish treasury is empty. The Burgundian lands are in turmoil. The German princes regard him as a foreigner, a boy who speaks with a Flemish accent, who knows nothing of their ways. Francis is spending gold like water. If Charles is to win the throne, he must outspend the King of France. Jakob Fugger listens. His counting house in Augsburg, a building of sober stone that hides a labyrinth of vaults and ledgers, becomes the nerve center of the most expensive political campaign Europe has ever seen. He does not hesitate. He knows that a Habsburg emperor is an investment that will pay dividends for generations. He knows that Francis, if elected, will favor the Italian bankers, the Medici, the Genoese, who have long been the Fuggers' rivals. He knows that the crown is not merely a prize, it is a necessity. He writes to Charles. His letter is not the fawning prose of a courtier. It is the cold, precise language of a banker outlining terms. He will advance the sum of 850,000 gulden, a fortune that could buy a kingdom, to secure the votes of the electors. The money will flow through his network of agents, carried by trusted messengers who ride day and night across the Alpine passes. The bribes will be delivered in the right amounts, at the right times, to the right men. Jakob Fugger does not simply provide money, he provides a machine. The campaign unfolds over the summer of 1519. Messengers ride from Augsburg to Frankfurt where the electors gather. They carry letters of credit, sacks of silver, promises written on parchment that bear the Fugger seal. The electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier and Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, are men of varying loyalties and appetites. Jakob Fugger knows each one. He knows their debts, their ambitions, their weaknesses. He does not simply outspend Francis, he outmaneuvers him. He offers not just gold but security. He offers not just bribes but bonds. He weaves a web of obligation that no single payment can break. Francis's agents, for all their chests of French gold, cannot match this strategy. They offer money, the Fuggers offer futures. They offer one-time payments. The Fuggers offer lines of credit that will sustain the electors for years. The archbishops, whose sees are in perpetual debt, choose the man who will keep their treasuries full. The secular princes, who fear the growing power of France on their borders, choose the man who will protect them. On June 28, 1519, the electors gather in Frankfurt. They cast their votes. Charles of Habsburg, the 19-year-old ruler of half the world, is unanimously elected Holy Roman Emperor. He owes his crown to a weaver's grandson from Augsburg. The news reaches Jakob Fugger not with a trumpet fanfare, but with a whispered word from a clerk who has just returned from Frankfurt. The banker does not rise from his desk. He does not smile. He notes the result in his ledger, a single line of ink that records the largest political expenditure in human history. Then he returns to his work. For Jakob Fugger, the election is not an end. It is a beginning. He has bought an emperor. Now he must collect. Charles V, as he will be known, is now the most powerful man in Europe, but he is also the most indebted. The 850,000 gulden are only the beginning. The new emperor inherits his grandfather's wars, his father's debts, and his own insatiable need for cash. He will fight the French, the Turks, the German Protestants, the rebellious Spanish communes. He will need armies, ships, cannons, diplomats. He will need money. And there is only one man in Europe who can provide it on the scale he requires. Jakob Fugger does not see himself as a servant of the emperor. He sees himself as a partner, and he expects the terms of that partnership to be honored. He demands control of the Spanish silver mines, the mercury mines of Almaden, the copper production of Hungary. He demands repayment schedules that favor his liquidity. He demands that his agents be given access to the imperial court, that his letters be answered before all others. Charles, for all his power, is in no position to refuse. He signs the contracts, seals them with the imperial eagle, and returns them to Augsburg. The Fugger Bank now holds a portfolio of sovereign debt that makes it, in effect, the treasury of the Holy Roman Empire. Rival bankers watch in stunned silence. The Medici, the great family of Florence, once the preeminent financiers of Europe, have been reduced to shadows, their bank mismanaged, their political influence shattered. The Genoese, who will later rise to challenge the Fuggers, are still finding their footing. For now, there is only one name that matters when kings need money. Jakob Fugger has done what no private citizen has ever done. He has placed a crown on a head of his choosing, and he holds the contract that proves it. But power of this magnitude does not go unnoticed. The princes of Europe, The very men who accepted Fugger gold to cast their votes begin to whisper. They speak of the Augsburg merchant who sits in his counting house and decides the fate of nations. They speak of the web of debt that entangles their courts, the agents who know their secrets, the ledgers that record their every weakness. They speak of the Fugger lily, the family's crest, that now blooms in the vaults of palaces across the continent, a flower that drinks not water, but gold. Jakob Fugger hears the whispers. He does not care. He has not risen from a weaver's workshop to the pinnacle of European finance by concerning himself with the opinions of princes. He understands a truth that most of them cannot grasp. Money is the only power that does not require a title. A king can lose his throne. A bishop can lose his see. A general can lose his army. But a banker who holds the debts of a continent holds something that no army can take. He is now 60 years old. His hair has grayed. His hands tremble slightly when he writes, but his mind remains as sharp as the quill he holds. He has built an empire that stretches from the silver mines of the Andes to the copper works of the Carpathians, from the counting houses of Lisbon to the trading posts of Antwerp. He has made himself the richest man in the history of the world. And he is about to do something that no merchant has ever done. He will build a monument not to his wealth, but to his soul. The Fugger, the world's first social housing complex, rises on the edge of Augsburg. It is a walled city within a city, a community of modest houses built for the poor, the infirm, the families who have fallen on hard times. The rent is a single gulden per year, a symbolic sum that has not changed for 5 centuries. In return, the residents pray 3 times a day for the soul of Jakob Fugger and his family. It is an act of charity, yes, but also an act of calculation. In an age when salvation is bought with good works and endowments, Jakob Fugger is securing his place in heaven with the same precision he applies to his ledgers. He is not merely building houses, he is buying eternity. At the same time, he commissions the Fugger Chapel in the Church of St. Anna. The architects design a space of breathtaking austerity and power, black marble columns, bronze grills, a vaulted ceiling that seems to press down on the worshipper. In the center, 2 stone effigies lie side by side, Jakob and his brother Ulrich, their hands clasped not in prayer, but in the confident gesture of men who have mastered their world. The inscription, carved in Latin, is a statement of purpose that brooks no argument. He lived a life of industry and thrift, and by his own merits rose to a position from which he could support kings and princes. The words are carefully chosen. Jakob Fugger does not claim to be a king. He does not need to. The kings come to him. But the monument he builds is also a warning. The black marble, the bronze, the heavy silence of the chapel, these are not the decorations of a man who expects his dynasty to last forever. They are the decorations of a man who knows that all empires, even those built on gold, eventually crumble. He looks at his heirs, the nephews and cousins who will inherit his empire, and he sees men of talent, but not genius. He sees men who can maintain but not build, who can count but not create. He wonders, perhaps, whether the web he has woven will survive his passing. In his final years, he works with a fury that belies his age. He consolidates the family holdings, writes a will that binds his heirs to joint action, dictates letters to the emperor that remind Charles of his debts, both financial and moral. He does not slow down. He does not rest. He is building a wall against the future, a fortress of contracts and obligations that he hopes will outlast him. On the morning of December 30, 1525, the clerks in the counting house notice that the master has not arrived. They find him in his chamber, his ledger open on the desk, his quill still in his hand. Jakob Fugger, the richest man in history, has died as he lived, at work, surrounded by the numbers that shape the world. The news spreads through Augsburg in hours, through Germany in days, through Europe in weeks. The emperor, far away in Spain, receives the report and orders a mass to be said for the soul of the man who made his reign possible. The princes who owe him fortunes breathe a sigh of relief. The poor who live in his Fugger light candles and say the prayers he demanded. The Fugger Empire passes to his nephews. They inherit the ledgers, the contracts, the mines, the trading posts. They inherit the debt of the Habsburg Emperor, the largest single financial obligation in Europe. They inherit a name that carries more weight than any title of nobility, but they do not inherit the mind that built it all. The weaver's son, the monk who became a banker, the man who bought an emperor, is gone. And the question that hangs over his dynasty is the question that hangs over all empires built by a single genius. Can it survive the man who made it? The vaults of the Fugger Bank do do not echo with the clink of coin. They echo with silence. Jakob the Rich has been dead for less than a year when his nephews gather in the counting house on the Maximilianstrasse. The room is cold despite the autumn sun slanting through the leaded glass windows. The ledgers lie open on the master's desk, the same desk where Jakob spent his final hours, and the numbers they contain are a testament to genius and a warning to those who would follow him. The empire is intact. The mines still produce. The agents still report from Lisbon, Antwerp, Krakow. The emperor still owes the family an amount that could fund a war, but the hand that guided it all is gone, and the nephews, Raymond, Anton, and the others, must now decide what kind of men they will be. They are not weak men. Raymond, the eldest, has spent years managing the family's operations in the Tyrolean mines, descending into the dark shafts where men work by candlelight and the air is thick with the dust of silver. He knows the cost of wealth in human terms. Anton, the most gifted of the three, has run the Venetian branch, learning the subtle arts of Mediterranean finance, the codes and courtesies that separate the bankers of the south from their northern cousins. They have been trained in the Fugger way, double-entry bookkeeping, the management of risk, the cultivation of powerful clients. But training is not genius, maintenance is not creation, and the world they now face is not the world their uncle conquered. The Europe of 1526 is a continent in convulsion. The Lutheran Reformation has shattered the unity of the Church, and with it, the old certainties that underpin the political order. The German princes are choosing sides, aligning themselves with either the emperor or the reformers, and those choices carry financial consequences. The Peasants' War, which swept through southern Germany in the final years of Jakob's life, has left fields fallow and treasuries empty. The Emperor, Charles V, is locked in a struggle with Francis I of France that seems to have no end, a conflict that consumes gold faster than the mines of the New World can produce it. The Fugger fortune is no longer a private matter. It is a fulcrum on which the balance of Europe rests. The nephews make their first decision quickly. They will not divide the business. Jakob's will, drafted with the precision of a legal scholar, binds them to joint operation, to shared risk and shared reward. The Fugger von der Lilly will continue as a single entity, a syndicate of brothers bound by blood and contract. It is a wise decision, perhaps the only decision that could preserve what they have inherited. But wisdom is not vision. And in the years that follow, the Fuggers will face challenges that no contract can anticipate. The first of these challenges arrives from Spain. Charles V, for all his power, is a man who lives on borrowed time and borrowed money. His wars against France, his campaigns against the Ottoman Turks, his endless diplomatic maneuvers, all of it requires cash, and the cash comes from Augsburg. The Fuggers have advanced the emperor more than 2 million gulden since the election of 1519. The interest alone is a sum that could buy a principality, but the emperor's payments are erratic. He promises, he delays, he promises again. His agents in Antwerp and Augsburg write letters filled with assurances that are belied by empty treasuries. The nephews look at the ledgers and see a pattern they do not like. The emperor's debt is not shrinking, it is growing. Every new war requires a new loan. Every new loan is secured against future revenues from the mines of the New World, the silver fleets that cross the Atlantic once a year, if they are not sunk by storms or pirates. The Fuggers are no longer simply bankers to the emperor. They are partners in his regime, bound to his fortunes, unable to withdraw their support without risking the collapse of everything they have built. The web that Jakob the Rich wove so carefully has become a trap. In 1527, the trap springs. The emperor's army, unpaid and mutinous, marches on Rome. The soldiers, a rabble of German Lutherans and Spanish adventurers, sack the eternal city with a ferocity that shocks Christendom. They loot churches, desecrate altars, drag cardinals from their palaces. Pope Clement VII, the Medici Pope who has long been a rival of the Fuggers, takes refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo while his city burns. The news reaches Augsburg in fragments, carried by merchants and priests who have fled the Italian peninsula. The Fugger agents in Rome send desperate letters describing the chaos, the destruction, the collapse of credit that has followed in the army's wake. For the Fuggers, the sack of Rome is not merely a tragedy, it is a financial disaster. The Pope is a debtor. The Italian bankers who handled much of the papal business are ruined. The network of credit that linked the Mediterranean to the north has been shattered, and the emperor, whose unpaid army caused the catastrophe, is now more indebted than ever. He writes to Anton Fugger, the nephew who has emerged as the family's leader, asking for more money. He does not apologize, he does not explain. He simply asks, as if the Fugger treasury were his own. Anton reads the letter in the counting house, the same room where his uncle once decided the fate of empires. He is a man of considerable ability, possessed of the Fugger instinct for leverage and the Fugger patience for long-term investment. But he is not Jakob the Rich. He looks at the emperor's request and sees the same pattern that has been unfolding for years: more debt, more risk, more entanglement. He also sees the alternative. If he refuses, if he calls in the emperor's debts, the Habsburg Empire will collapse, the French will advance, the Turks will pour into Hungary, the German princes will fight among themselves. The Fugger fortune, tied so intimately to the Habsburg cause, will be swept away in the chaos. There is no choice. Anton Fugger dips his quill in ink and writes the letter authorizing another loan. The amount is staggering: 100,000 gulden, enough to rebuild the army that destroyed Rome. The emperor receives the news with relief that borders on gratitude. He writes back, addressing Anton as "our dear, loyal, and beloved." The words are courteous, but they carry the weight of chains. The Fuggers are now so deeply entangled with the Habsburgs that there is no path to freedom that does not lead through ruin. The years that follow test the Fugger Empire as it has never been tested before. The emperor's wars grind on, each campaign demanding fresh infusions of cash. The Turkish armies of Suleiman the Magnificent sweep up the Danube, laying siege to Vienna in 1529. Charles V, desperate to hold the line, turns again to Augsburg. The Fuggers advance another 200,000 gulden, then another 300,000. The sums become so large that they lose meaning, existing only as numbers in ledgers, as entries in a calculus of power that has no end. Anton Fugger watches the debt mount and feels the weight of his uncle's legacy pressing down on him. Jakob the Rich built an empire by lending to princes who could not refuse his terms. Anton has inherited an empire that cannot refuse the princes. The balance of power has shifted, subtly but irrevocably. When Jakob lent to Maximilian, he dictated the terms. When Anton lends to Charles, he accepts what he is given. The emperor is no longer a client. He is a partner, and in any partnership between a banker and a king, the king holds the ultimate advantage. He can default, he can delay, he can promise repayment in the vague future, and there is no court in Europe that can compel him to honor his word. The Fuggers are not the only bankers learning this lesson. Across Europe, the great financial houses of the 16th century are discovering that lending to sovereigns is a game with no exit. The Genoese, the Florentines, the Portuguese conversos, all of them pour gold into the treasuries of kings, and all of them struggle to get it back. The difference is that the Fuggers have no one to share the risk. Their exposure to the Habsburgs is absolute. If the emperor falls, they fall with him. In 1531, the emperor's Protestant enemies in Germany formed the Schmalkaldic League, a military alliance aimed at checking Habsburg power. The religious divide that has been widening since Luther's defiance now becomes a political fracture. Charles V, who has spent his reign trying to hold the Catholic world together, finds himself facing rebellion from within. He needs money for an army to crush the Protestants. He needs more money to bribe the German princes who remain neutral. He needs money, always money, and there is only one place to get it. Anton Fugger travels to Brussels to meet with the emperor. It is a journey his uncle would never have made. Jakob the Rich received kings in his counting house, on his own ground, surrounded by his ledgers and his clerks. Anton goes to the imperial court, and the symbolism is not lost on either man. The banker comes to the king. The audience is private, conducted in the emperor's chambers, away from the whispering courtiers who watch every interaction for signs of weakness. Charles V, now in his 30s, is a man worn down by the weight of an empire too vast for any one man to govern. His pale face is lined with the fatigue of constant travel, of shuttling between Spain, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, trying to hold together a realm that spans 2 hemispheres. He speaks in a low voice, his Flemish accent still present after years of ruling Spanish subjects who resent him as a foreigner. He asks for another loan. He does not threaten, he does not bargain, he simply states his need and waits. Anton looks at the man who holds half the world in his keeping, and he sees a debtor, a powerful debtor, a man who commands armies and navies and the silver fleets of the New World, but a debtor nonetheless. The moment stretches. Anton could refuse. He could demand repayment of the existing loans, force the emperor to liquidate his assets, to sell his Burgundian lands, to mortgage the Spanish mines. He could bring the Habsburg Empire to its knees with a single word. He does not. He agrees to the loan, on terms that are generous by any standard. The emperor thanks him, calls him cousin, offers him a place at court. Anton accepts the honors and returns to Augsburg, where the ledgers now show a debt that exceeds 5 million gulden. The Fugger Empire is no longer a business. It is a lifeline, and the man at the other end of the line holds the knife. The stress begins to show in the family. Raymond Fugger, the eldest nephew, retreats from the day-to-day operations, turning his attention to the acquisition of land and titles. He buys the county of Kirchberg and the lordship of Weissenhorn, transforming himself into a territorial magnate, a man whose power is measured in villages and forests rather than ledgers. It is what Jakob the Rich never did, what he always disdained, the exchange of liquidity for land, of risk for security. Raymond sees the future differently from his uncle. He sees a Europe where the great merchant houses are being squeezed between the rising power of nation-states and the constant drain of sovereign debt. He wants his family to survive, even if it means giving up the heights of financial power. Anton disagrees. He believes the Fuggers must remain what they have always been, the bankers of Europe, the men who move the money that moves the world. The argument between the cousins is conducted in letters, in private conversations, in the tense silences that fill the counting house when they meet. It is a dispute about the nature of power itself. Raymond argues for the old nobility, for land and titles, and the security they provide. Anton argues for the new economy, for credit and influence, and the fluid power of money. Neither man is wrong, neither man is entirely right, and the unresolved tension between them weakens the firm at the moment it needs strength most. The emperor's debts continue to mount. In 1532 he defaults, not formally, not with a declaration that would shatter his credit for generations. He simply stops paying. The silver fleets from the New World arrive, but the gold is diverted to the armies fighting the Turks. The revenues from the Spanish crown are pledged to other creditors, Genoese bankers who have begun to offer terms the Fuggers cannot match. Charles V writes to Anton, expressing his great sorrow at the delay, promising that payment will come as soon as God grants us the means. The letter is courteous, even affectionate. It is also worthless. Anton reads the letter in his counting house and understands what his uncle understood decades earlier. A king's promise is only as good as his treasury. The difference is that Jakob the Rich never let the treasury get this far out of his control. He lent to princes, but he held their mines, their tolls, their revenues as collateral. He took control of the assets that produced the wealth. Anton and his cousins have lent to the emperor without demanding the same guarantees. They have accepted his word, his signature, his imperial seal, and now that word is not enough. The Fuggers are not ruined. The family still controls the Tyrolean mines, the copper production of Hungary, the trading networks that span the continent. But the great engine of their power, the ability to lend on a scale that no other bank can match, is stalled. The emperor's default has frozen a massive portion of their capital, money that cannot be deployed elsewhere, cannot be used to fund new ventures, cannot earn the interest that pays for the family's growing appetite for land and title. Anton looks at the ledgers and sees the future his uncle tried to prevent. A slow, grinding decline, a transformation from the masters of European finance into just another wealthy family, one among many. He refuses to accept it. In 1534, he takes a gamble that would have made Jakob the Rich proud. He opens negotiations with the King of Portugal, seeking access to the spice trade of the East Indies. The Portuguese crown, facing its own financial pressures, is willing to offer terms. The Fuggers agree to advance a massive sum in exchange for the right to purchase pepper and spices at discounted rates. It is a move into a new arena, a diversification that could free the family from its dependence on the Habsburgs. The first ships return from Lisbon loaded with cargo, and the counting house in Augsburg buzzes with the energy of a new venture. For a moment, it seems that Anton has found a way out. But the moment passes. The emperor, hearing of the Portuguese deal, sends his ambassadors to remind the Fuggers of their obligations. He does not threaten openly, but the implication is clear. The family that finances the King of Portugal cannot also be the family that holds the Habsburg debt. A choice must be made. Anton makes it. He withdraws from the Portuguese trade, focusing instead on the Habsburg Empire that has become both his fortune and his prison. The pepper ships sail without Fugger gold, and the opportunity fades into memory. The pattern repeats in the years that follow. Every attempt to diversify, to reduce the family's exposure to the Habsburgs, is met with imperial pressure. The Fuggers are not free agents. They are the emperor's bankers, and the emperor will not allow them to become anyone else's. The web that Jakob the Rich wove to entangle kings has become a net that holds his own family captive. The year 1547 brings a moment of triumph that seems, for a brief instant, to justify every risk the Fuggers have taken. The emperor, at last, defeats the Schmalkaldic League at the Battle of Mühlberg. The Protestant princes are crushed, their armies scattered, their leaders captured. Charles V, mounted on a war horse, rides through the captured camp with a crucifix in his hand, a gesture that announces the victory of the old faith over the new. For a man who has spent his reign fighting on every front, this is the culmination of a lifetime of struggle. The empire is his. The heretics are subdued. The dream of a unified Christendom, with the Habsburg emperor at its head, seems within reach. The Fuggers celebrate. Anton, who has financed the campaigns that led to this moment, allows himself a rare display of optimism. He writes to his agents across Europe, instructing them to prepare for an expansion of operations. The emperor, he believes, will now turn his attention to governing, to stabilizing his finances, to repaying the debts that have made his victories possible. The ledgers in Augsburg show advances of more than 8 million gulden to the Habsburg cause, a sum so vast that it defies comprehension. But with the emperor secure on his throne, with the Protestant threat neutralized, the time for repayment has come. It does not come. Charles V, victorious at last, does not settle his debts. He does not stabilize his finances. Instead, he turns his attention to the succession, to the division of his empire, to the abdication that will, within a decade, see him retire to a monastery in Spain. The emperor who fought for a unified Christendom will end his life as a man who could not hold his own inheritance together. He will divide his lands between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand, splitting the Habsburg domains into Spanish and Austrian branches. And in the process, he will leave the Fuggers holding the debts of an empire that no longer exists as a single entity. Anton watches this unfold with the same dread his uncle must have felt when Maximilian died. The emperor who owes him millions is not merely a debtor. He is a structure, a system, a network of obligations and relationships that holds the family's fortune together. When Charles abdicates, when the empire is divided, that structure will shatter. The debts will be split between two courts, two treasuries, two sets of priority. The Fuggers will have to negotiate with both, to rebuild their relationships from the ground up, to collect what they can from rulers who inherited obligations they did not incur. In 1552, the crisis comes. Maurice of Saxony, a Lutheran prince who has been the emperor's ally, turns against him. Leading a coalition of German princes, he marches against Charles V, threatening to undo everything the emperor has achieved. The Habsburg forces, depleted and unpaid, cannot resist. Charles V is driven from Germany, forced to flee to the Netherlands, his dream of imperial unity shattered. The Fuggers, who have lent millions to the emperor, are left to face the consequences. Anton writes to the emperor demanding payment. His letter is respectful, even deferential, but the urgency behind the words is unmistakable. The Fuggers are overextended. The defaults of the Spanish crown, the constant demands for new loans, the diversion of funds to the Portuguese venture that never materialized, all of it has left the family exposed. If the emperor does not pay, if the Habsburg Empire collapses, the Fuggers will collapse with it. Charles V replies with a letter that reveals the true nature of their relationship. He cannot pay. He has no money. The war has drained his treasury. The German princes who have turned against him were financed, in part, by Fugger gold that was meant for the emperor. The irony is bitter. The Fuggers have lent to both sides, not out of treachery but out of necessity, trying to maintain their position in a Europe that is tearing itself apart. Now both sides owe them money, and neither side can pay. The family begins to fracture under the strain. Raymond, who long ago retreated from the counting house to his lands and titles, argues for a complete withdrawal from finance. Let the emperors find other bankers, he says. Let the Genoese and the Portuguese take the risk. The Fuggers have wealth enough to live as nobles, to build castles and marry into princely families, to secure their future in land and blood rather than ledgers and credit. Anton resists. To abandon finance, he argues, is to abandon the family's identity. The Fuggers are not lords. They are merchants, bankers, men of the counting house. If they give that up, they give up everything that made them great. The argument is never resolved. Raymond dies in 1556, leaving his lands and his titles to his heirs. Anton carries on, but the fire that drove Jakob the Rich is gone. He manages the family's affairs with competence, even brilliance, but he does not create. He does not gamble. He does not take the risks that made his uncle the master of Europe. The Fugger Empire, at the height of its power, begins the slow process of contraction. In 1560, Anton Fugger dies. He is not old, not worn down by the decades of struggle that marked his uncle's life, but he is tired. The ledgers on his desk show the same pattern that has defined the family's existence for 40 years. Massive advances to the Habsburgs, partial repayments, new advances, endless negotiation. The emperor's debt, the great engine of Fugger power, has become a burden that no one can lift. Anton leaves instructions for his heirs, a document that reads more like a confession than a will. He warns them against the dangers of sovereign lending, against the temptation to extend credit beyond the point of safety, against the illusion that a king's promise is as good as gold. The warnings come too late. The Fuggers are already trapped. The Habsburgs owe them more than 12 million gulden, a sum that represents the accumulated wealth of a century of labor and risk. Some of that debt will be repaid, in fits and starts, over the decades that follow. Some of it will never be repaid. The silver fleets from the New World will arrive, and the Spanish crown will divert the gold to its other creditors, the Genoese bankers who have learned from the Fuggers' mistakes. The German princes who borrowed from Augsburg will default, renegotiate, default again. The great syndicate that Jakob the Rich built will continue to operate, but it will never again command the power it once held. Shadows lengthen over the counting house on the Maximilian Strasse. The clerks still scratch their quills across the ledgers. The messengers still ride out with letters of credit. The agents still sit in counting houses from Lisbon to Krakow. But the pulse that drove the whole system, the relentless, creative, terrifying ambition of Jakob Fugger, has stopped. His nephews and their heirs will manage the empire he built. They will preserve it, protect it, pass it down through the generations, but they will not build it anew. They will not buy an emperor or decide the fate of Europe. They will become, in the end, what Raymond always wanted them to be, a wealthy family, respected and secure, but no longer the masters of the world. The Syndicate of Shadows, the name whispered by princes who feared the power of Augsburg, fades into the ordinary light of history. The bank that owned the Holy Roman Empire becomes a bank like any other, a name in the ledgers, a footnote in the accounts of kings. The weavers' sons who rose to rule the world return, slowly, inevitably, to the station from which they came, not in poverty, not in disgrace, but in the quiet acceptance of limits that Jakob the Rich never knew. The question that haunted his final years, can an empire built by one man survive him, finds its answer not in collapse but in fading. The Fuggers do not fall, they descend, they do not crash, they drift. The shadow they cast across Europe, once so deep that kings walked in it, grows thin. The light that forged them, the light of a weaver's workshop in a village called Graben, flickers and fades. But the story is not over. The empire that Jakob built, the web of credit and obligation that bound the Habsburgs to Augsburg, will have one more act. The debts that his nephews could not collect, the defaults that drained the family's treasury, the slow contraction of the great Fugger enterprise, all of it is merely the prelude to a final reckoning. The bankers who own the Holy Roman Empire will watch that empire crumble. They will see the Habsburgs, their greatest clients and their greatest burden, fade into the same history that is already claiming them. And they will learn, in the end, what Jakob the Rich never understood, that no empire, not even one built on gold, can last forever. The counting house grows quiet, the ledgers close, the quills are laid down, and the shadow that once covered Europe begins, at last, to lift. The city of Augsburg wakes on the morning of January 16, 1556, to a sound it has not heard in living memory. The bells of St. Ulrich's, of St. Anna's, of the cathedral, of a dozen parish churches, begin to toll in a slow, deliberate rhythm, not the frantic peal of celebration, nor the sharp clang of alarm, but the measured cadence of an ending. The sound rolls across the rooftops, spills into the narrow streets, penetrates the thick walls of the Fugger counting house, where the clerks pause in their work, quills suspended over ledgers, and listen. The news has traveled from Brussels by fast messenger, the horses ridden to exhaustion, the rider arriving in the grey hours before dawn with a letter sealed with the imperial eagle. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands and the Two Sicilies, Master of the Indies, the most powerful man in the world, has abdicated. The announcement does not come as a surprise. The emperor has been preparing for this moment for years, slowly divesting himself of the crowns that weigh upon his shoulders. But hearing the news, feeling it settle into the bones of the city that has financed his reign for 4 decades, is something else entirely. The Fugger clerks look at each other across the counting tables. They know what this means. The emperor who owes them millions is walking away. His debts will pass to his son Philip in Spain and his brother Ferdinand in Austria. 2 courts, 2 treasuries, 2 sets of obligations, 2 opportunities for delay, for dispute, for default. The web that Jakob the Rich wove to bind the Habsburgs to Augsburg is about to be cut in 2. In the private chambers above the counting house, Anton Fugger's nephews gather. The elder generation is gone. Anton himself died 4 years earlier, leaving the firm in the hands of his heirs, men who have grown up in the shadow of Habsburg debt, who have watched their uncles struggle against the weight of imperial obligation. They are not weak men, these new Fuggers, but they are not Jakob. They inherit a business that is still vast, still profitable, still the greatest financial house in Europe. But they also inherit a problem that has no solution. An emperor who owes them more than they are worth, and who is no longer emperor. The abdication of Charles V is the culmination of a life spent in the saddle, a life of constant motion, constant struggle, constant disappointment. The man who once dreamed of a unified Christendom, of a single faith under a single ruler, has watched that dream dissolve. The Protestants could not be defeated permanently. The French could not be subdued. The Turks could not be pushed back. And the money that was supposed to make it all possible, the silver from the New World, the credit from Augsburg, only seemed to make the problems worse. Charles V, now 56 years old, is a man worn to the bone. He has rheumatism. He has gout. He has a body that has carried the weight of empire for too long. He wants to go home. Home, for Charles V, is not a palace or a capital. It is a monastery in Extremadura, a place called Yuste, where he will spend his remaining years in a small house attached to a church, watching clocks and praying for the souls of his ancestors. Before he goes, he settles his accounts, not the financial accounts, those will take generations to resolve, but the accounts of his life. He divides his inheritance with the care of a man who has spent his reign trying to hold things together and now accepts that they must come apart. His son Philip receives Spain, the Netherlands, the Italian possessions, the empire in the Americas. His brother Ferdinand receives Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The Habsburg domains, which Charles tried so hard to unify, are split, and the Fugger debts, which were owed to a single emperor, are now owed to 2. The clerks in Augsburg open new ledgers. On one side, they record the debts of Philip II of Spain. On the other, the debts of Ferdinand I, Holy Roman Emperor. The totals are staggering. The Spanish debt alone exceeds 7 million gulden, a sum that represents the accumulated wealth of a century of Fugger labor. The Austrian debt adds another 2 million. The Fuggers are on paper the largest creditors in Europe, but paper is not gold. And the men who now owe them money are not the men their uncle lent to. Philip II is a different kind of ruler. Where his father was a traveler, a soldier, a man of the world, Philip is a bureaucrat, a man of paper and procedure, who will govern from a desk in the Escorial, the vast palace monastery he is building outside Madrid. He is devout, meticulous, and utterly ruthless. He inherits his father's debts, but not his father's gratitude. The Fuggers, for all their service to the Habsburg cause, are to Philip just another set of creditors, to be managed, delayed, and, if necessary, discarded. Ferdinand I is a different creature entirely. He has spent his career managing the Austrian lands, fighting the Turks on the Hungarian frontier, negotiating with the German princes. He is pragmatic where Charles was idealistic, flexible where his brother was rigid. He owes his throne to the Fuggers, who financed his campaigns and smoothed his path to the succession. But he also owes them money, and money, in the end, is what matters. The Fuggers send ambassadors to both courts. They carry letters of credit, lists of obligations, requests for repayment schedules. The ambassadors return with polite words, vague promises, and no money. Philip II, they report, is planning a new war against France. Ferdinand I is building a new fortress on the Turkish border. Neither ruler has funds to spare for old debts. The Fuggers are told to wait, to be patient, to trust in the gratitude of princes. They have been waiting for 40 years. They are tired of waiting. The year 1557 brings a disaster that will echo through the Fugger ledgers for generations. Philip II of Spain, his treasury drained by years of war, does something that no Habsburg ruler has done in living memory. He declares a moratorium on his debts. The technical term is cessation de pagos, a suspension of payments. The practical effect is that every creditor who has lent money to the Spanish crown, the Fuggers, the Genoese, the Portuguese, the German banking houses, is told that repayment will be delayed indefinitely. The crown will continue to pay interest, Philip promises, but the principal must wait. The Fuggers look at their ledgers and see a fortune frozen. The moratorium is not a default, it is something worse. A default, a clean break, would allow the Fuggers to write off the debt, to cut their losses, to move on. A moratorium is a suspension, a state of limbo that leaves them trapped, unable to collect what they are owed but unwilling to abandon the possibility of eventual repayment. They must continue to service the debt, to maintain their agents in Spain, to negotiate with the crown, to hope that someday, somehow, the money will come. In the meantime, the capital that should be earning interest, that should be reinvested in new ventures, that should be growing the family's fortune, is locked in the vaults of the Spanish treasury, earning nothing. The Fuggers are not alone in their suffering. The Genoese bankers, who have become the Fuggers' rivals in the Spanish market, are hit even harder. Their exposure to the crown is more concentrated, their reserves thinner. Some of them will fail. Others will survive, learning from the Fuggers' example, diversifying their portfolios, spreading their risk across multiple sovereigns. But the Fuggers, tied so intimately to the Habsburgs by decades of partnership, cannot diversify. Their fortune is the Habsburg fortune. Their fate is the Habsburg fate. In Augsburg, the family begins to splinter. The younger generation, the sons and grandsons of the nephews who inherited Jakob's empire, look at the ledgers and see a future they do not want. They see endless negotiation, endless delay, endless waiting for kings who have no intention of paying. They see their capital tied up in sovereign debt that yields nothing. They see the great Fugger enterprise, once the engine of European finance, becoming a museum of past glories. Some of them choose to follow the path Raymond charted decades earlier. They buy land, acquire titles, marry into the old nobility. They become what their grandfathers never were: aristocrats, men of the countryside, lords of villages and forests. The counting house on the Maximilianstrasse becomes, for them, a memory, a relic of a time when the family's power was measured in credit rather than acres. Others remain. They stay in the counting house, managing the family's remaining assets, negotiating with the Spanish and Austrian courts, trying to collect what they can. They are competent men, honest men, men who understand the ledgers as well as their ancestors did. But they are not Jakob. They do not create, they do not build, they do not buy emperors or decide the fate of nations. They manage, and in managing, they preside over a slow, dignified decline. The Fugger, the social housing complex that Jakob built to secure his soul, continues to operate. The residents still pay their single gulden per year. They still pray 3 times a day for the soul of the founder. The little houses, with their white walls and red roofs, remain a haven for the poor of Augsburg, a monument to the man who rose from the loom to the throne. But even the Fugger becomes, in these years, a symbol of the distance the family has traveled. Jakob built it to ensure his place in heaven. His heirs maintain it because it is the one thing they cannot sell, the one obligation they cannot escape. The Spanish moratorium drags on. Philip II fights his wars, builds his palaces, governs his empire. The silver fleets continue to arrive from the New World, the galleons heavy with bullion from Potosi and Zacatecas. But the silver does not go to the Fuggers. It goes to the Genoese, who have negotiated better terms, who have learned the lesson the Fuggers never learned. Never let a single debtor control your destiny. The Fuggers watch the silver flow past them into the vaults of their rivals, and they understand that the age of Fugger dominance is over. In 1575, Philip II declares another moratorium. The Fuggers are now owed more than 8 million gulden by the Spanish crown, a sum that represents the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of labor. They will never collect it. Over the decades that follow, they will receive partial payments, interest payments, promises, and more promises. But the great fortune that Jakob the Rich built, the fortune that bought an emperor and funded an empire, will never be fully recovered. It will be eaten away by inflation, by delay, by the relentless pressure of sovereign default. The Fugger Bank does not fail. It does not collapse. It contracts slowly, gracefully, like a tree losing its leaves in autumn. The branches in Lisbon close. The agents in Antwerp are recalled. The counting house in Augsburg grows quieter, the clerks fewer, the ledgers thinner. The family continues to trade, to lend, to invest. They remain wealthy, respected, secure, but they are no longer the masters of Europe. They are no longer the power behind the throne. They are, in the end, what Raymond always wanted them to be: a noble family, rich and influential, but not exceptional. The emperor's purse, which Jakob the Rich held in his hands, passes to other keepers. The Genoese bankers, the Portuguese conversos, the Dutch merchants of Amsterdam, these will be the financiers of the next century. They will learn from the Fuggers' example. They will diversify their portfolios, spread their risk, never allow a single sovereign to become their master. They will build fortunes that rival Jakob's, and they will watch those fortunes fade in turn. The cycle repeats. The lesson is never learned. The final act of the Fugger drama unfolds not in a counting house, not in a palace, but in a monastery in Extremadura. Charles V, the man who owed them everything and paid them nothing, dies on September 21, 1558. He is surrounded by his servants, his clocks, his books. He holds a crucifix in his hands, the same crucifix he carried at Muhlberg, the same crucifix that witnessed his greatest victory. He dies as he lived, alone, burdened, a man who carried a weight no human shoulders were meant to bear. The news reaches Augsburg weeks later. The Fuggers do not mourn. Charles V has been dead to them for years, his promises empty, his signature worthless, but they take note of his passing. With his death, the last link to the age of Jakob the Rich is severed. The emperor who was bought, the crown that was purchased, the empire that was financed, all of it is history now. The Fuggers are no longer the bankers of the Holy Roman Empire. They are the bankers who were. The past tense settles over the counting house like dust. In the decades that follow, the family retreats from finance. The great trading operations, the mines, the networks of agents, all of it is wound down, sold off, converted into land and titles. The Fuggers become what the old nobility has always been, landowners, patrons, collectors. They build palaces, commission art, marry into the families of princes. They preserve the memory of Jakob the Rich, the weaver's son who bought an emperor, but they do not try to repeat his achievement. The world has changed. The age of private financiers, of merchant families who could rival kings, is ending. The nation-states are rising. The great banks of Amsterdam and London are forming. The Fuggers, who once owned the Holy Roman Empire, are becoming a footnote in the history they once shaped. But the ledgers remain. In the vaults of the Fugger house, the records of the family's transactions are preserved, page after page of double-entry bookkeeping, each entry a moment in the life of the firm. The loans to Maximilian, the bribes to the electors, the advances to Charles V, the endless renegotiations, the partial repayments, the defaults. It is all there, written in the careful hand of generations of clerks. The ledgers are not merely accounts. They are a diary of power. They record not just the flow of money, but the flow of history. One entry, written in the hand of Jakob the Rich himself, stands out. It is dated 1521, 2 years after the election that made Charles V emperor. The entry records a loan of 100,000 gulden to the new emperor, to be repaid from the revenues of the Spanish crown. In the margin, Jakob has added a note, written in the same precise script he used for all his annotations. Ich hab den Kaiser gemacht, I have made the emperor. The words are not boastful. They are a statement of fact, a recognition of what the Fuggers had accomplished. A family of weavers from a village no one had heard of had reached into the heart of European power and placed a crown on the head of their choosing. They had done what no private citizens had ever done, and what no private citizens would ever do again. The age of the merchant prince, the banker king, the man who could buy an empire with a stroke of a quill, reached its peak in that moment. And then, like all peaks, it began to descend. The Fuggers did not fall, they faded. They did not lose their fortune, they transformed it. They did not vanish from history, they receded into it. The weavers' sons who rose to rule the world became, in the end, what their ancestors had been, a family rich and respected, but no longer exceptional. The shadow they cast across Europe, once so deep that kings walked in it, grew thin. The light that forged them, the light of a workshop in Graben, flickered and faded. But the ledgers remain, and in those ledgers, the story of the Fuggers is preserved. The ambition, the risk, the triumph, the entanglement, the slow, inevitable decline. It is a story that speaks to something fundamental in the human condition, something that transcends the specifics of 16th century finance. It is the story of how power is built, how it is wielded, and how, in the end, it slips through even the strongest fingers. The weaver's son who bought an emperor is gone. The empire he bought is gone. The debts that bound them together are paid or defaulted or forgotten. All that remains is the ledger, the record, the trace of a moment when a man sat in a counting house in Augsburg and decided the fate of Europe. That moment is over. But the questions it raises about the nature of power, the limits of wealth, the legacy of ambition, are not over. They are as alive today as they were in 1519. The bells of Augsburg toll. The counting house grows quiet. The quills are laid down. And the Fuggers, the bankers who own the Holy Roman Empire, become what all empires become. A memory, a story, a lesson written in ink that will not fade. The morning light falls on the Fugger as it has fallen for nearly 5 centuries. It spills over the whitewashed walls, catches the red clay tiles of the roofs, pools in the narrow lanes that run between the rows of houses. A gatekeeper, dressed in the sober grey of the Fugger livery, turns the great key in the lock, and the residents emerge, one by one, into the day. They are the poor of Augsburg, the widows and the aged, the families who have fallen on hard times, the men and women who would otherwise sleep in doorways or beg at church steps. Here within the walls of Jakob Fugger's charity, they have shelter, a roof, a garden, a community. They have in exchange one obligation: 3 times a day, they must pray for the soul of the man who built this place. The Fugger is not a monastery. It is not a poorhouse. It is something unique in the history of Europe, a social housing project, conceived and built by a private citizen, funded by a fortune that could have bought a kingdom. Jakob, the rich, began construction in 1514, at the height of his power, when his name was whispered in every court in Europe. He designed it himself, or so the story goes, walking the streets of Augsburg with his architects, pointing out the sites of the city's worst slums, measuring the distance between the gates and the churches, calculating the cost of each house, each garden, each wall. He was a man who measured everything, who counted everything, who left nothing to chance. The Fugger was his final calculation, his last and most enduring investment. The houses are modest. Each one contains a single room, a kitchen, a small garden. They are not grand, they are not palaces, but they are solid, clean, built to last. Jakob the Rich, who financed the wars of emperors and the ambitions of kings, chose to build his legacy not in marble or gold, but in brick and mortar in the lives of the poor. The rent is 1 gulden per year, a sum that has never changed, a sum so small that it is almost a gesture. The residents pay it, and in return they receive a home, a community, a place in the order Jakob created. But the Fugger is not merely charity, it is also a contract. The residents who live within its walls are required to pray 3 times a day for the Fugger family, for the souls of the founders, for their salvation. Jakob the Rich, who spent his life accumulating wealth, understood that he could not take it with him. He built the Fugger as a bridge between this world and the next, a structure of good works that would carry his soul across the divide. The prayers of the poor, he believed, would weigh more in the balance of judgment than the gold of kings. He calculated his salvation with the same precision he applied to his ledgers. The Fugger stands today as it stood then, a walled city within a city, a monument to a man who believed that wealth and faith could be reconciled, that the counting house and the church were not opposites but partners. The residents still pray, the gatekeeper still locks the gates at night, the gardens still bloom, and Jakob Fugger, the weaver's son who bought an emperor, still receives, 5 centuries later, the prayers he purchased. But the Fugger is not the only monument Jakob built. In the church of St. Anna, a few streets away, lies the Fugger Chapel, a space of such austere beauty that it seems to belong to another world entirely. The walls are lined with black marble, polished to a mirror shine. The ceiling vaults above, painted with scenes from the Last Judgment. The bronze grills that separate the chapel from the nave are wrought with such skill that they seem to shimmer in the candlelight. And in the center of it all, 2 stone effigies lie side by side, Jakob Fugger and his brother Ulrich, their hands clasped not in prayer, but in the confident gesture of men who have mastered their world. The chapel is a declaration. It says without words that the Fuggers are not merely wealthy, they are not merely powerful, they are a dynasty, a force that will endure beyond the lives of any single generation. The black marble is a warning, the bronze is a promise, the inscription carved into the stone is a statement of purpose. He lived a life of industry and thrift, and by his own merits rose to a position from which he could support kings and princes. Jakob the Rich, who never held a title, who never commanded an army, who never ruled a province, carved his name into the stone of Augsburg and dared history to forget him. History has not forgotten. The Fugger still stands, the chapel still draws visitors, the name Fugger still carries weight, still evokes the age when a family of merchants could challenge the power of kings. But the monuments Jakob built are also monuments to something else: the limits of wealth, the fragility of power, the slow, inexorable passage of time. The black marble is still polished, the bronze grills still shimmer. But the dynasty that built them, the empire of ledgers and loans that stretched across Europe, is gone. All that remains are the stones, the prayers, the memory. The Fugger and the Fugger Chapel are not merely monuments. They are also mirrors, reflecting the complex psychology of the man who built them. Jakob the Rich was a paradox, a man of immense wealth who lived modestly, a man of ruthless ambition who endowed charity, a man who spent his life accumulating gold and then tried to give it away in the form of salvation. He was, in the end, a man who understood that money could not buy everything. It could buy an emperor, yes. It could buy mines and trading posts and the loyalty of kings, but it could not buy peace, it could not buy faith, it could not buy the one thing he wanted most, eternity. The Fugger was his answer to the problem of eternity. By housing the poor, by securing their prayers, he hoped to secure his soul. It was a transaction, like any other transaction in his ledgers, a payment in exchange for a service. But it was also something more. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps unconscious, that the life he had lived, the empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, were not enough. He needed the prayers of the poor because he knew, in the quiet hours of the night when the ledgers were closed and the candles burned low, that his fortune was a burden as well as a blessing. The Fugger Chapel is another kind of acknowledgement. It is a monument to family, to blood, to the bonds that hold a dynasty together. Jakob built it not for himself alone, but for his brothers, his nephews, his heirs. He wanted the Fugger name to endure. He wanted the dynasty to outlast him. But the chapel is also a warning. The black marble, the bronze grills, the heavy silence, these are the decorations of a man who knew that death was coming, that all empires end, that even the greatest fortune cannot stop the clock. In the years after Jakob's death, the family continued to build. They added to the Fugger, expanding it, creating new houses for new residents. They maintained the chapel, commissioning new art, new decorations, new inscriptions. They tried in their way to preserve the legacy Jakob had created, but they could not preserve the man. And without the man, the empire he built began to crumble. The seeds of that crumbling were planted in the same soil that produced the Fugger and the chapel. Jakob's genius was also his weakness. He built his fortune on a single relationship, the Habsburg dynasty. He lent to the emperors, financed their wars, secured their thrones, but in doing so, he tied his family's fate to the fate of the Habsburgs. When the emperors prospered, the Fuggers prospered. When the emperors struggled, the Fuggers struggled. And when the emperors defaulted, the Fuggers defaulted with them. The Fugger and the chapel are not merely monuments to Jakob's piety. They are also monuments to his miscalculation. He believed that the Habsburgs would always honor their debts, that the empire he helped build would always protect his family's fortune. He was wrong. The emperors defaulted. The empire fragmented. The fortune that built the Fugger and the chapel was, in the end, not enough to secure the dynasty he hoped to create. The residents of the Fugger do not know this history. They know only the houses, the gardens, the gatekeeper, the prayers. They know that a man named Fugger built this place, that his heirs maintain it, that the rent is 1 gulden per year. They do not know the weight of the debt that financed it, the wars that drained the treasury, the defaults that eroded the fortune. They know only the walls, the roof, the safety, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the Fugger is, in the end, the truest monument to Jakob Fugger. Not a palace, not a title, not a dynasty, but a place where the poor can live, where the prayers are said, where the memory endures. But the Fugger is also a house of cards. It is built on wealth that was borrowed, on credit that was extended, on promises that were not kept. The walls are solid, the roofs are sound, the gardens bloom, but the foundation, the fortune that made it all possible, has crumbled. The Fuggers are no longer the richest family in Europe. They are no longer the bankers of the Holy Roman Empire. They are in the end, what Jakob never wanted them to be, ordinary. The chapel in St. Anna's still draws visitors. They come to see the black marble, the bronze grills, the effigies of the brothers. They read the inscription, trace the letters with their fingers, wonder at the audacity of a man who could write, by his own merits, rose to a position from which he could support kings and princes. They do not know that the kings defaulted. They do not know that the princes betrayed. They do not know that the fortune that built this chapel was, in the end, a house of cards, waiting for the wind to blow. The wind came. It came in the form of Spanish moratoriums, Austrian defaults, Genoese competition. It came in the form of inflation, war, religious division. It came in the form of heirs who lacked the genius of the founder, who managed rather than created, who preserved rather than built. The house of cards did not collapse all at once. It settled slowly, gracefully, like a ship sinking into calm water. The cards did not scatter. They slid one by one into the depths. The final years of the Fugger Empire are not marked by drama. There is no single moment of collapse, no dramatic bankruptcy, no public scandal. The family simply fades like a painting left too long in the sun, the colors bleeding into each other, the outlines softening, the image dissolving into memory. The counting house on the Maximilianstrasse remains open, but the clerks are fewer, the ledgers thinner, the transactions smaller. The branches in Lisbon and Antwerp close. The agents in Krakow and Venice are recalled. The great network that once spanned Europe contracts, pulling back to Augsburg, to the family seat, to the houses and lands that Raymond Fugger bought so many years ago. The Fuggers become, in these years, what they were before Jakob, a wealthy family, respected but not exceptional. They hold titles now, the titles Raymond coveted, the titles that Jakob disdained. They are counts and princes, men of the old nobility, lords of villages and forests. They marry into the families of kings. They build palaces and collect art. They live, in short, the lives that Raymond always wanted for them. But they are no longer the masters of Europe. They are no longer the power behind the throne. They are, in the end, just another noble family, rich and influential, but not unique. The Fugger continues. The residents still pay their gulden. They still pray 3 times a day. The gatekeeper still locks the gates at night. The little houses, with their white walls and red roofs, remain a haven for the poor of Augsburg. The Fugger is the one thing the family never sells, the one obligation they never escape. It is their anchor, their monument, their penance. It is the thing that connects them to Jakob, to the weaver's son who bought an emperor, to the man who built a fortune and then tried to give it away. The chapel in St. Anna's continues. The black marble is polished. The bronze grills shimmer. The effigies of the brothers lie in the center, their hands clasped, their eyes closed, their faces frozen in the confident expression of men who believed they had mastered time. The inscription still reads, "He lived a life of industry and thrift, and by his own merits rose to a position from which he could support kings and princes." The words are still true in their way. Jakob did rise, he did support kings. He did buy an emperor, but the kings are dead, the emperor is dead, the empire is dead, only the words remain. The visitors who come to the chapel do not know this. They see the beauty, the craftsmanship, the audacity. They read the inscription and wonder at the man who could write such words. They do not know the cost of the fortune that built it. They do not know the debts that were never repaid, the defaults that eroded the capital, the slow decline that followed the peak. They see only the monument, not the foundation. They see only the house of cards, not the cards themselves. The Fuggers, in the end, are a warning. They are a lesson in the limits of wealth, the fragility of power, the impossibility of buying eternity. Jakob the rich believed that money could buy anything, an emperor, a fortune, a place in heaven. He was wrong. The emperor he bought defaulted. The fortune he built crumbled. The place in heaven he purchased with the Fugger and the chapel is, in the end, not his to guarantee. The prayers of the poor are still said, 5 centuries later, but Jakob Fugger's soul is beyond the reach of prayers. He is history now, a name in a ledger, a memory in stone. The house of cards that he built, the empire of ledgers and loans that stretched across Europe, is gone. All that remains are the Fugger, the chapel, the memory, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the Fugger, the little houses where the poor still live, the gardens that still bloom, the prayers that are still said, is the truest monument to Jakob Fugger. Not the fortune, not the power, not the dynasty, but the act of building, the act of giving, the act of creating something that outlasts the creator. The weaver's son who bought an emperor is gone. The emperor he bought is gone. The empire he bought is gone. But the Fugger stands, the chapel stands, the memory stands. And in that memory there is a lesson for those who come after. That wealth is not power, power is not permanence, and permanence is not eternity. The house of cards, no matter how carefully built, will eventually fall. All that remains are the cards themselves, scattered on the table, waiting for someone to pick them up and start again. The archive of the Fugger family lies in a vault beneath the Fugger house, a room of stone and silence where the light enters only through a single window set high in the wall. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint, sweet scent of old paper, of leather bindings, of ink that dried 5 centuries ago. Rows of shelves stretch into the dimness, each one filled with ledgers, letters, contracts, receipts, the records of a dynasty, the paper trail of an empire. A clerk, one of the few who still tend to the family's affairs, pulls a volume from the shelf and opens it on a reading stand. The pages are heavy, the parchment stiff with age, the handwriting precise and unbroken. It is a ledger from the year 1525, the year Jakob the Rich died. The entries are in his own hand. Loans to the emperor, advances to the mines, payments to the electors. The numbers are still clear, the calculations still exact, the sums still staggering. But the man who wrote them is dust. The vault holds more than ledgers. It holds letters, hundreds of them bound in bundles with red ribbon. Letters from Charles V, written in the cramped hand of a man who spent his life on horseback, each one promising repayment, each one apologizing for delay. Letters from Ferdinand, from Philip, from the agents who managed the family's affairs in Lisbon and Antwerp and Krakow. Letters from Jakob himself, dictating terms to kings, instructing his clerks, warning his heirs. The words are preserved, the ink unfaded, the paper uncrumpled, but the voices are silent. The hands that held these pages are gone, the minds that conceived these words are dust. The Fugger family does not visit the vault often. They are not the men their ancestors were. They are counts and princes now, lords of lands that stretch across Bavaria, patrons of the arts, collectors of paintings and sculptures. They live in palaces, not counting houses. They ride to hounds, not to the exchange. They have become, in the centuries since Jakob's death, exactly what Raymond wanted them to become, aristocrats. The counting house on the Maximilianstrasse is still there, still owned by the family, but it is a museum now, a place for tourists to visit, for students to study, for historians to ponder. The clerks who once filled its rooms, who moved the money that moved the world, are gone. The ledgers that recorded their transactions are in the vault, gathering dust. But the vault is not a tomb, it is a testament. The records it holds are not merely historical artifacts, they are the bones of an empire. They tell the story of how a family of weavers rose to rule the world, how they built a fortune that rivaled kingdoms, how they lent to emperors and bought crowns. And they tell the story of how that empire ended, not with a crash, not with a scandal, but with a slow, graceful fade, a settling of dust, a quiet closing of ledgers. The Fuggers did not fall. They descended, they did not vanish, they receded. They became, in the end, what they had always been, a family, rich, respected, influential, but no longer exceptional. The question that hangs over the vault, over the ledgers, over the memory of Jakob the Rich, is the question that haunts all dynasties. What does it mean to build something that outlasts you? Jakob built a fortune, but the fortune is gone. He built an empire, but the empire is gone. He built a dynasty, but the dynasty is no longer what he intended. His heirs are not bankers. They are aristocrats. They do not move the money that moves the world. They live on the interest of the interest, on the lands and titles that Raymond bought so many years ago. They are, in the end, the grandchildren of the weaver's son, but they are also something else. They are the proof that no empire lasts forever. The vault holds the ledgers hold the numbers tell the story, and the story in the end is not about the money. It is about the men who made it, the men who spent it, the men who lost it. It is about ambition and risk, triumph and decline, the rise and fall of a dynasty. It is about Jakob Fugger, the weaver's son who bought an emperor, and about his heirs, who could not hold what he built. It is about the dust that settles on all empires, the silence that follows all noise, the fading of all light. The clerk closes the ledger and returns it to the shelf. The vault grows quiet. The light from the high window shifts, the shadows lengthening, the dust motes floating in the fading beam. The records of the Fugger Empire wait in the darkness, preserved, protected, forgotten. They are the dust of ages, the residue of a dynasty, the trace of a moment when a man sat in a counting house in Augsburg and decided the fate of Europe. That moment is over. The ledgers are closed. The quills are laid down. And the Fuggers, the bankers who own the Holy Roman Empire, become what all empires become: a memory, a story, a lesson written in ink that will not fade. The transformation of the Fuggers from bankers to aristocrats takes centuries, but the pattern is set in the decades following Jakob's death. The nephews who inherit his empire are competent men, but they are not builders. They manage what he created. They do not expand it. They lend to the Habsburgs because they have always lent to the Habsburgs. They do not seek new clients, new markets, new opportunities. They are prisoners of their own success, bound to the dynasty that made them and then broke them. The Spanish moratoriums of 1557 and 1575 drain their capital, force them to retrench, to consolidate, to retreat. The Genoese bankers, who have learned from the Fuggers' example, move into the vacuum. The Fuggers watch their rivals rise and do nothing. They are tired. They are cautious. They are, in the end, not their uncle's heirs. Raymond Fugger, the nephew who retreated from the counting house to his lands and titles, becomes the model for the generations that follow. His descendants buy more land, acquire more titles, build more palaces. They become the Fugger counts, the Fugger princes, the Fugger lords of villages and forests. They marry into the families of Bavarian dukes, Austrian archdukes, Spanish grandees. They are no longer merchants, they are nobles. They no longer count their wealth in gulden. They count it in acres, in castles, in the number of peasants who work their fields. They have achieved, in death, what Raymond always wanted. They have become the old nobility. But the old nobility is not the same as the new power. The world is changing. The nation-states that are rising, Spain, France, England, the Dutch Republic, are building their own financial systems, their own banks, their own treasuries. They no longer need private financiers like the Fuggers. They can raise money from their own subjects, from their own institutions, from the new stock exchanges that are opening in Amsterdam and London. The Fuggers, who once held the purse strings of Europe, are irrelevant to this new order. They are aristocrats now, and aristocrats, in the new world of nation-states and national debts, are decorative, not essential. The Fugger continues. The residents still pray. The gatekeeper still locks the gates. The little houses with their white walls and red roofs are still a haven for the poor, but even the Fugger becomes, in these centuries, a symbol of the distance the family has traveled. Jakob built it to secure his soul. His heirs maintain it because it is the one thing they cannot sell. It is their anchor, their monument, their obligation. It is the thing that connects them to the man they have become, the man they have forgotten, the man who built an empire and then tried to give it away. The chapel in St. Anna's continues. The black marble is polished. The bronze grills shimmer. The effigies of the brothers lie in the center, their hands clasped, their eyes closed. The inscription still reads, "He lived a life of industry and thrift, and by his own merits rose to a position from which he could support kings and princes." The words are still true, but they are also a reminder of what the family has lost. The Fuggers no longer support kings. They no longer support anyone. They are supported by their lands, their titles, their investments. They have become the very thing Jakob never wanted, dependent, passive, living on the past. Vault holds the ledgers hold the story, and the story in the end is not about the money. It is about the choices the Fuggers made, the choices they failed to make, the path they took and the path they abandoned. They chose land over liquidity, titles over trade, nobility over commerce. They chose to become what Raymond wanted them to become, and in doing so they chose to end the empire Jakob built. The counting house on the Maximilian Strasse is still there, but it is a museum, not a bank. The ledgers are still there, but they are archives, not accounts. The name is still there, but it is a memory, not a power. The dust settles on the vault, on the ledgers, on the effigies in the chapel. The prayers are still said in the Fugger, but the man who paid for them is dust. The visitors come to the chapel, read the inscription, wonder at the audacity. They do not know the cost. They do not know the debt. They do not know the decline. They see only the monument, not the foundation. They see only the house of cards, not the cards themselves. The final chapter of the Fugger story is not written in ledgers or letters. It is written in stone, in the Fugger, in the chapel, in the palaces the family built in the centuries after Jakob's death. It is written in the memory of Augsburg, the city that was once the center of European finance and is now a quiet provincial town, proud of its past but living in the present. The Fuggers are still there. They are still wealthy. They are still respected, but they are no longer the masters of Europe. They are no longer the power behind the throne. They are, in the end, just another family, rich and influential, but not unique. The weaver's son who bought an emperor is gone. The emperor he bought is gone. The empire he bought is gone. All that remains are the monuments, the Fugger, the chapel, the ledgers in the vault, and the memory of a moment when a man sat in a counting house in Augsburg and wrote, in the margin of a ledger, the words that defined his life, "Ich hab den Kaiser gemacht." I have made the emperor. It is not a boast, it is a fact. A man of no birth, no title, no army, reached into the heart of European power and placed a crown on the head of his choosing. He did what no private citizen had ever done, and what no private citizen would ever do again. The age of the merchant prince, the banker king, the man who could buy an empire with a stroke of a quill, reached its peak in that moment, and then, like all peaks, it began to descend. The Fuggers did not fall, they faded. They did not lose their fortune, they transformed it. They did not vanish from history, they receded into it. They became in the end what their ancestors had been, a family, rich, respected, influential, but no longer exceptional. The visitor who stands in the Fugger Chapel today, looking at the black marble and the bronze grills, reading the inscription, tracing the letters with a finger, may not know this history. They may see only the beauty, the craftsmanship, the audacity. They may not know the cost. They may not know the debt. They may not know the decline. But if they listen, if they wait in the silence of the chapel, they may hear something. Not a sound, not a voice, but an echo. The echo of a quill scratching across parchment. The echo of a ledger closing. The echo of a man who built an empire and then watched it fade. The Fugger still stands. The chapel still stands. The memory still stands. And in that memory, there is a lesson for those who come after. Wealth is not power, power is not permanence, permanence is not eternity. The house of cards, no matter how carefully built, will eventually fall. All that remains are the cards themselves, scattered on the table, waiting for someone to pick them up and start again. The weaver's son who bought an emperor is dust. The emperor he bought is dust. The empire he bought is dust. But the Fugger still stands. The chapel still stands. The ledgers are still in the vault. And the name Fugger is still spoken, still remembered, still written in the history of Europe. It is not the name of a king. It is not the name of a conqueror. It is the name of a weaver's son who understood that money, properly used, could move the world. And then, in the end, that the world, properly moved, would move on without him. The bells of Augsburg toll. The counting house grows quiet. The quills are laid down. And the Fuggers, the bankers who own the Holy Roman Empire, become what all empires become: a memory, a story, a lesson written in ink that will not fade. The light in the Fugger Chapel is the color of old gold, filtered through windows that have watched 5 centuries pass. It falls on the black marble, the bronze grills, the stone effigies of the 2 brothers who lie with their hands clasped, their eyes closed, their faces turned toward eternity. Jakob Fugger, the weaver's son, the monk who became a banker, the man who bought an emperor, sleeps here. He sleeps in the city that made him, in the church where he prayed, in the chapel he built to house his memory and his soul. The inscription beneath his feet reads, in Latin, the story of his life. He lived a life of industry and thrift, and by his own merits rose to a position from which he could support kings and princes. The words are not boastful, they are a statement of fact. A man of no birth, no title, no army, reached into the heart of European power and placed a crown on the head of his choosing. He built a fortune that rivaled kingdoms. He built a dynasty that outlasted him. He built a monument to his ambition, his faith, his fear. And then he died as all men die, leaving behind only the echo of his quill, the trace of his ink, the dust of his empire. The visitor who stands in the chapel, reading the inscription, tracing the letters, may wonder what it means. What does it mean to support kings? What does it mean to buy an emperor? What does it mean to build something that outlasts you? The answers are in the ledgers, in the vault, in the stones of the Fugger, in the prayers that are still said 3 times a day. The answers are in the rise and fall of a dynasty, the triumph and decline, the peak and the fade. The answers are in the dust of ages, the silence that follows all noise, the fading of all light. Jakob Fugger bought an emperor, the emperor defaulted. Jakob Fugger built a fortune, the fortune crumbled. Jakob Fugger built a dynasty, the dynasty faded. All that remains are the ledgers, the chapel, the Fugger, and the memory of a weaver's son who refused to die with wool dust on his hands, who climbed from the loom to the counting house, from the counting house to the throne, from the throne to the grave. He did what no private citizen had ever done, and what no private citizen would ever do again. And then he became what all men become, dust. The light in the chapel shifts, the shadows lengthen, the visitor turns and walks toward the door, leaving the effigies to their silence, the black marble to its polish, the bronze to its shimmer. The door closes with a soft click. The chapel is empty, the dust settles, and the Fuggers, the bankers who own the Holy Roman Empire, are history.